There we go. All right. Well, welcome. It's good to have you join us live for the first edition of Neighboring 101 in a new year, 2024. This is actually session number 44 overall. Isn't it amazing
Wow.
how time flies?
That's amazing.
And so Neighboring 101 is something we do every month. We gather together, we talk with leaders in the neighboring movement and discover ways for organizations and individuals to use the art and skill of neighboring as part of community and individual development and improvement. So thanks for being here. I'll drop some names in chat here soon. We have 7 new class members this month, and I'll drop those names in chat so you can see them and welcome them. That brings our active enrollment, active class up to 653 from across the United States. And we still have a little over 700 enrolled, but 650 are more active and watching videos or either attending live and doing other participation. Just a couple of announcements real quick. Some of these are in the email that go out, but in case you didn't see them, I want to bring a few of them to your attention. We are screening the movie Join or Die, which is a documentary about the importance of joining organizations and volunteering in your community. We're screening that here in Springfield on March 19th and March 20th. You can purchase your tickets on the extension website, extension.missouri.edu. You get free popcorn and free drinks with your ticket. So, it's worth the $10 ticket, and hope you can join us for those nights. And I know someone else, Lindsay, who's out in the state of Washington, is going to be screening that same movie here pretty soon. So I hope you can join us if you're in the Springfield area. Also a reminder, in the Springfield area, but really this can be done nationwide. March 20th is Mr. Rogers' birthday. And so it's something nationally we started calling Won't You Be My Neighbor Day. You can find that website real easily. It's won'tyoubemyneighborday.com. And we're encouraging people to do acts of kindness in celebration of Mr. Rogers' birthday on March 20th. And hope you could participate and let us know what you've done on that day. Also, if you're on here, that means you're already registered for Neighboring 101, but we have a bonus speaker at the end of February, and you have to register for it separately or, in addition to this one. On February 29th, we'll be talking with Richard C. Harwood. He's from the Kettering Foundation, and he's written a book called Unleashed, which focuses on unleashing the potential of the people in your community or neighborhood. So Richard Harwood, many of you may recognize that name. Ripple effects theory, that's a Harwood thing. He's an author of a number of books known nationally. Speaking of national, the National Conference for Neighborhoods USA is going to be in Lubbock, Texas, May 22nd to May 25. That website is nusa.org if you're interested in registering and attending that conference in Lubbock, Texas. Hope to see a few of you there. So be watching your emails for other information about Neighborhood Exploration Week that's coming up in March, other activities and events. And then also that's where you find the only place you can find links to these class recordings. Also a preview of what's coming up on Neighboring 101, and then we'll get into Kendra's introduction and get going. February 15th, next month, the topic is creating and sustaining a Love Your Neighbor Week in your town. We'll be having a panel discussion with Sean Boulderjack, Rachel Privet, and Justin Perry, who are the organizers of the Love Thy Neighbor Week in Dent County, Missouri. What was the TV show? Oh, Extreme Home Makeover. Do you remember that show? They do a version of that in Dent County, all compressed into 1 week, mobilizing hundreds and hundreds of volunteers to do all sorts of projects on people's homes in that county. So introduce you to that project. In March, our guest will be Dr. Anita Knight Cunley. She is the author of the Mr. Rogers Effect, 7 Secrets to Bringing Out the Best in Yourself and Others from America's beloved neighbor. And that's in keeping with our Mr. Rogers theme for that month. And then in April, author Todd Swanstrom, who's just released a book called The Changing American Neighborhood. He will be joining us for Neighboring 101 as well. Well, enough for announcements, because we want to make the best use of everybody's time, including our guest, Kendra Broekhuis. Am I saying that correct?
No, but that's okay. It's actually pronounced Broekhuis. Or if
Broekhuis.
you're Dutch, you can say Broekhuis. So all sorts of options.
If I do the Dutch version, I may break out into a song, because that's a little close to Brick House. But Brooke,
Yes.
Brooke,
They sang that at my wedding, actually.
did you really? Oh, how fun.
Yeah.
Well, Kendra, it is great to have you here. Kendra was raised in West Michigan. She attended Dordt University in Iowa, and that's where she met her husband, Colin. They were married, and they moved to oh my lands. Have you ever had one of those moments?
Yes.
I have forgotten. It was a Latin American country, Guatemala.
Oh, yes, Guatemala.
Yes, they moved to Guatemala to teach at an inter-American school there for 3 years. And in 2016, the couple returned to the United States just south of Chicago. But in her own words, they kind of struggled with that transition back to the U.S., as well as the loss of their second child at 33 weeks of pregnancy. So now they did eventually welcome a baby boy to the family, and they moved to Milwaukee for Kendra's husband's teaching job, or his new teaching job. So they have a boy and a girl at home, and Kendra, in all of her spare time, writes books and blogs, but especially the book that we're talking about today. She has a new one coming out in March. Between You and Us is the name of the novel that comes out in March. But today we're talking about Here Goes Nothing, an introvert's reckless attempt to love her neighbor. Now, I guess mine doesn't show up, but it's a beautifully published book, great cover, great read. Kendra, long introduction there. Sorry, but welcome. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you for having me. And that was a wonderful introduction. Thank you. I will add as well, there's 2 more kids now.
Really?
Yeah. We have 4 at home. So 2 more girls since then, which has been fun.
How
It takes
how
up a
do you
lot of
find
time.
the time to write another book with 4 kids to keep track of? Wow.
A lot of help. No one can do it all, right? And that's that's the important part of making friends with neighbors and having a community around you of support, because that's the only way that I was able to do that. But
And a fair
another
amount of
aspect
discipline.
of that was my husband being a teacher. So with him home in the summers, then it was my turn to work.
Well, and a fair amount of discipline too, I would imagine, sticking
Yeah,
with the
yeah.
writing.
hmm
You know, there's 2 excuses that I hear most often from people about why they don't connect with their neighbors. I'm too busy, or I'm an introvert. And so this topic has been something I've been thinking about how we could get a guest on here for probably a year to cover the topic of being an introvert. But most of what I was reading was kind of research focused, and things was a little research heavy. I was really just looking for something that, had some practical suggestions, and was just really about how someone else had gone about doing that. And then lo and behold, found your book, Here Goes Nothing. So I love the fact that I think it's practical. It gives some great ideas. And so just to give a little highlight or intro here, introvert versus extrovert. Carl Jung in 1920s described these 2 personality extremes. And he says the basic definition is an introvert prefers minimally stimulating environments and needs time alone to recharge. That's an introvert. And so if you are an introvert, getting to know your strangers or your neighbors, getting to know strangers as well, is right up there with going to the dentist and having and filling out tax forms. It sounds horrible, but Kendra, when did you first discover that you were an introvert?
Um, I became very aware of it when I moved into different contexts, like moving overseas, moving back to the States, but then into an apartment building. And thinking I just had this really idealized version of what a neighbor should look like in my head. And then I just kept on realizing over and over that I was never that neighbor. I was not the naturally outgoing, bubbly neighbor. Um, I could not like go long times of like socializing without feeling like I needed some recovery time. Uh, and then honestly, motherhood really ramped that up, really just made
Mm.
me realize how introverted I was, because suddenly it wasn't like I could, go interact with a neighbor and then go home and shut my door. It was like, no, there's people everywhere all the time. And that just really made me realize like, oh, I need this downtime to recharge, to be at the best version of myself, if possible, every once in a while.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think I've heard people who describe themselves as introverts when there is a party or a social gathering plan, they kind of they like to know the starting time and the ending time. They like to know how to
Mhm.
pace themselves. Does this come and go? Things
Yeah.
like that that we can do that can
Mhm.
maybe help. Have you found that to be the case for you? You kind of is need to know a
Definitely. Oh,
plan part of being an
definitely.
introvert, I guess. I'm sorry.
I I think too that a lot of people are that way, and there's a beauty in knowing like, hey, I know the importance of connection. I know the importance of having a safety net of friendships and neighbors that I can turn to or just have like everyday connections with. But that can be built up in small chunks of time, small but meaningful chunks of time. And I think that is one of the powers of
Mm,
introverted people is that it's always quality over quantity. So we can, sit down and have a cup of coffee for an hour and maybe have more meaningful conversation or meaningful connection than what could happen over an entire weekend spent with somebody, because that 1 hour of quality time has made that meaningful connection. So I think it's just good to remember too that we don't need to overwhelm ourselves with these wild expectations of what we should be doing as neighbors. At times it can be small but meaningful, and that can go a long ways, especially when you think of the long game of like, I'm building this relationship over time. My goal is not to become best friends with my neighbor overnight. It's a relationship that can be built
yeah, I
for the long haul.
think that's a great point. Extroverts may be more inclined to saying, let's do a block party for 100 people.
Yeah.
Woohoo! Go for it.
Uh-huh.
And your strength lies in building those deep personal relationships. So when you do that with neighbors, that can be that's really powerful for proximity and other reasons too. But yeah,
Hmm.
there's great value in that.
Hmm. And I when I lived in an apartment building in Chicago, that was in a suburb of Chicago, I did a lot of times where it was like, pass out the flyers, come over, this day for this time, which was really great. I like that aspect of an apartment building because, in the middle of winter, no one wants to leave the house anyway, but you can still walk down the hall and hang out with your apartment buddies. And there were a lot of times where I put on my little invitations, like, it's just for an hour. Just drop in when you can. There will be snacks, these, clear buffers for, some of the at times awkward social interactions.
Yeah.
But also like a clear time too, because I think again, when it comes to some of like the social anxiety that people might feel when it comes to getting to know new people, or again, not every introvert has social anxiety. I want to be clear about that. But for people who do, just knowing like, you know what, I can go for an hour. That's not a huge commitment. And just having some of those parameters can be helpful for everyone to just be willing to commit versus feeling overwhelmed by the commitment.
So tell us, in writing the book, what made you try a reckless attempt to get to know your neighbors? Why was that on your radar as something to do as an
Mhm.
introvert?
I really believed that, well, I should back up a little bit, because I guess the reason was actually when we lived in Guatemala. So when we lived in Guatemala, we became close friends with missionaries there, who their philosophy behind their ministry was, it was called incarnational ministry. So the idea was you are living and being neighbors with the people, living near and being like actual neighbors to the people that you want to serve.
Mhm.
And
Mm.
so after our time in Guatemala was done and it was time to move back to the United States, we really wanted to do that, and we wanted to do it in eventually in a city context, in like a community development context. Um, but the job that we got was in the suburbs, which was great. That was where we found a job and where we moved. But we asked them, we're like, where do we begin? Like, we know we want to eventually be working in community development in a city somewhere, but where do we begin now? Because no matter where you are, no matter what stage of life, what context you're in, you can always be getting to know your neighbor. And that was the advice that they gave us. They're like, just start by getting to know the people around you. It's best, again, not to have always these idealistic goals that are unattainable, but rather to simply get to know the people who live next door to you, which again for us was in our apartment building. So I was a stay-at-home mom. I had a 1-year-old in tow at the time. Um, and it was just, the goal was to do like 30 days to think about this, almost like challenge for myself, 30 days to either be reaching out to my neighbors in some way, or to be like thinking about what it means to be a neighbor. And so it was a whole month of different things, and really different lessons, different awkward encounters, which I think is important to remember, that sometimes it simply will be uncomfortable when we're reaching out to our neighbors, and that's okay. Like, it's okay that it doesn't always feel smooth or like this natural connection at the beginning.
Yeah. And we're going to have a few questions come up in chat here too that we'll get to in a moment as well. I know several on this Zoom have already read your book, and so they may especially have some questions they want to ask.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had situations in your book where you really had to kind of push through the awkward part of meeting your neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
After you pushed through, and now in hindsight, was that worth the effort? Because pushing through takes some effort. Was it worth the effort? Was
Mm-hmm.
it worth it?
I would say yes. I would say, and I say that saying like there were all sorts of different responses. I had people in my apartment building who I became very close with, and who became, they were like friends. They they were like friends, they were support in hard times that
Mm.
we experienced when we lost our baby while we were living there. I had other people who um we weren't close, but we at least knew each other by name, which was great. And then there were others who, never responded at all, never came to an event, never seemed interested in necessarily like getting to know us back. And that was fine. I've just felt more like, I want to think about not necessarily the responses I'm hoping to get, although you don't, you always hope for some great connections, but also to think simply like, no, what kind of neighbor do I want to be? Not
Mm.
necessarily what response am I going to expect from my neighbors? Like, down the road, looking back, what kind of neighbor do I want to be to the people around me?
Yeah, I think at one point in your book, I'd written down some quotes that I wanted to ask you about, and this one seems to fit right there. You had written, if we moved, would my neighborhood miss us? You asked that question in the book. Can you Can you answer that question now?
Oh, I think about that a lot. Yeah, my neighborhood context now is quite interesting. We live in an impoverished neighborhood in the city of Milwaukee. Um, it's pretty complicated. And so honestly, it feels hard to answer that question because there's a lot of work that we do in our neighborhood. And yet at times so for example, okay, my husband works at the school across the street from our house. And there's a lot of kids there who have trauma backgrounds, who are struggling in poverty contexts, who
Mhm.
come from difficult home life. And there are times where, he's working as a teacher. I'm still stay-at-home mom, with my 3-year-old is still home with me while my others are at school. And ways that we try and like be present neighbors and feeding into our neighborhood and taking care of our neighborhood. And there's times where it's hard because it feels like there is not much change. Um, we in our back alley experience a lot of trash being illegally dumped back there. We experience actually prostitution happening in the back of our alley. There's a lot of gun violence. There's a lot of
Mhm.
reckless driving that happens in our neighborhood. Just things like that, where it's actually the people who have been here for a long time and are not like adding to those issues are often inside their homes for safety at times, where it's hard to let your kids play outside when those are some of the things that are happening outside. And it's hard to want to connect with your neighbors when at times there's just like a bit of self-preservation and self-protection there. So I mean, I see the ways that we are trying to tangibly um be good neighbors and love our neighborhood. And yet there are times too where it feels discouraging because it's like, is this making any change? I don't know. But
Mm.
again, I feel like it helps me, it helps my husband as a teacher too, to think about like what kind of neighbors do we want to be? What kind of teacher does he want to be, no matter the outcomes?
Yeah, when I read that in your book, I thought, whew, that's a good question for all of us to ask ourselves, no matter our context, no
Mhm.
matter our type of
Yes.
neighborhood. If we moved here, would anybody even notice? Anybody
Mhm.
even? And so, I mean, we if we're called to love our neighbor, we've got to start by at least knowing their name. That's the first step. And
Mhm.
but then there's certainly other steps beyond that, and that I think that kind of goes along with that question. I thought that was a really great question in your book and something
Mhm.
to ask of ourselves. I see a few questions popping up in chat, although I've always got questions. Let me ask a couple of these here. Lydia asked, well, tells a story on herself first, I think. I have new neighbors that moved in about 3 years ago. Where do I even start after that much time has passed? Frankly, it's embarrassing, she says. Um, and I can certainly relate to that too, Lydia.
Mhm.
Kendra, what are thoughts you might add, and if you have introvert tips for reaching out in an
Uh-huh.
introvert context, that's even better.
I just think that there's probably so many of us who are like, oh, I feel this. I feel this in my core. And I think that maybe your neighbors feel that way too. And so I just like addressing what feels awkward at first because
Mhm.
it makes me feel like, well, at least that's out in the air. Everyone can just address this and acknowledge it, and then we can move on. So even if it is like, hey, I know, you've lived here a while, I've lived here a while, but I just want to make this connection with you now, or I just want to, meet outside for beverages after supper or for dessert after supper, something that's really low stakes.
Yeah.
And again, just acknowledges, hey, time has passed, but it's never too late to start these kinds of connections.
I remember in your book in the apartment setting, it was quarters at the washing machines, I think.
Mhm.
And other drop off sort of things were uh, those introvert approaches to
Oh,
making
yes.
those connections. Can't exactly do the quarters at the washing machine there in the neighborhood now, probably, but
No, no, but I honestly think like a lot of the things I do are pretty introvert friendly. For example, I love to read. And so I actually keep a little free library out in front of our house and I keep that filled. And there's lots of kids in our neighborhood who are pulling from that often. And I think, that's an introvert way. Sometimes in the winter we'll set out bags of gloves and hats. Sometimes even just throw canned goods in there. Um, Again, there's a lot of trash in my neighborhood, and I know that, like, it is amazing to me how great I feel after I've helped clean up some of the trash outside, like, just to see how clean it is and know that even just doing something like that with my 3-year-old who actually loves to help me, it's very adorable. But cleaning up the trash in our neighborhood and, like, knowing, like, that really does make a difference for how people feel about where they live, like, just us making things clean and safe for the other kids and other adults in the neighborhood too, can be a lot of introvert work as well.
I love that you pull your kids along with you, let them help out and get
Mhm.
involved. That's wonderful. As uh as kids that are now out of the house, let me just say those lessons stick with them, and they'll oftentimes follow along with the habits that you're demonstrating in there. That's wonderful. So, what are some other lessons that maybe you've learned from the whole experience? Because the book Here Goes Nothing is very introspective in a lot of ways, and it's been a few years since you've written it, so you've probably learned maybe some additional lessons, but or those lessons have maybe deepened in time. What would be some of those overall lessons that you would say you've learned?
Mhm. Um, I think a lot about the fact that I wrote this book before the year 2020.
Ah,
And I think even more just how important in-person relationships are,
mm,
um, because our proximity to other people matters so much more than our and I'm saying this like we do not need to like deep dive politics right now, but I just feel like our proximity to people is so important in our everyday life relationships. And I think that, this is, I mean, broken record, how much social media has negatively impacted relationships and how much I really do believe that our real life neighboring relationships can restore some of those areas that have been so torn to shreds over the past couple of years.
yeah.
Um, and I just think that's what I think about a lot over the past couple of years, especially of like, this is why it's so important to be neighbors, to like be active in our community, to think about what we want to contribute versus um, ways that we can have such a consumer mindset about our relationships as well. And yeah, I just think that like right in our own neighborhoods is the place to begin. Especially when I think too like I think it's really easy to become overwhelmed by the issues that we see in the world around us too. Um again, which is even especially thinking over the past couple of years. Um but there were a lot of times where I felt that being in a difficult neighborhood where my family is,
Mm,
that the world was swirling around us, but I felt like I was at least involved in something that was meaningful. I was at least, instead of putting my effort into like taking in more headlines and adding to the overwhelm, putting that energy into my hands and feet instead and into the relationships in my in my real life. And I think that that can be really grounding too, when it's so easy to get overwhelmed, to feel anxious about the state of the world today. Instead, let's close our laptops, let's turn off our phones, and let's go outside and like put our hands in the dirt again, to in our own real neighborhoods, and in connecting with other people.
Oh, I love that. And beautifully said too, as well. Many times I hear, social media get used as the excuse for not reaching out to neighbors in proximity. Oh, all my friend groups are all on social media. I'm an introvert, so I stay on social media, all sorts of
Mhm.
excuses.
Mhm.
But yeah,
I
beautiful.
Yeah, and I think too, like, so to get back on the introvert thing, and I'm sure there's a lot of introverts too. I've felt this before where it's like it just feels like extroverts are beloved and introverts are seen as something to be cured. And so I do think that there's probably a little there's probably a couple introverts who are like, I'm just tired of being told to be different than who I feel like I am at times, or and that just yeah, again, just always being told like be uncomfortable, be uncomfortable. But I will say I do one of my favorite words is tension, because it helps me instead of thinking of like the crazy pendulum swings to one side of the other, living in tension kind of in between those things. So when I think about that in terms of being an introvert, in terms of personality, I think, loving our neighbor will require tension, and it's going to require some tension of me sacrificing, because love requires sacrifice.
Mhm. Mhm.
Me at times being uncomfortable, me doing things that maybe don't feel like they always come naturally. And at the same time, the tension of like, and it's also okay to acknowledge that I need downtime. It's okay to make sure I have that in my schedule, so that, so that I am ready for when those opportunities come for me to connect with a neighbor that feel uncomfortable, but I know that I'm also taking care of myself. So I don't think it necessarily means that we have to it doesn't mean that we need to change our personalities. It doesn't mean we have to become extroverts.
Mm.
Like what we have as introverts is good, and it's wonderful to offer the world as well. So I always want to acknowledge that, because I'm like, I feel like introverts often feel like they need to be cured.
Well, that
No,
is
but also recognizing like love in all of its forms will require sacrifice at some point.
that is well said. I just to clarify, I love introverts. I'm married to one. And and I have discovered her skill sets are different than mine. Not
Mhm.
not not worse, not better. But
Right.
they're different. And so she has connect with neighbors, like you said, the one-on-one, having them small numbers to the house. Ladies, that's in her wheelhouse. I probably couldn't pull that off. And so I love that about her, right? And so as a team, that's a good team. And one of the comments here, uh, from Carolyn, the emphasis on parties as a way to connect instead of just coffee shop conversation,
Hmm.
or even these one-on-one types of conversation.
Hmm.
And so you're getting a double amen and a high five from a fellow introvert and Jennifer
High
Prophet.
five back.
um, well, what would you say to people who have maybe closed themselves off to their neighbors? And I think it's different than not maybe reaching out, but have really closed off, don't even make that effort. Do you see anything that helps break through those barriers? You've mentioned that there are some that you've tried to reach out to before and they don't respond.
Hmm.
Um, is there a better way to do that with those who are closed off, or is this just a issue that requires time? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I have a situation that actually I wrote about in my book where I was thinking about a neighbor who was having a lot of car issues. and I wanted to leave a note for that neighbor because he lived in the next building over. It wasn't a person that I crossed paths with a lot. And I left, I wrote a note and I left it on his windshield in proper introvert way of doing things. Um, and I never heard back from him, not in the course of many years of writing my book, having it published. And I think it was, and I included in there, if you ever want to connect, like we'd love to just get to know you, have you over for dinner, something. Here's my number. And did not hear back from him for a long time until 5 years later. And my family had moved from Milwaukee, moved to Milwaukee, and I get this random text one day from that neighbor, from that old neighbor,
Wow.
telling me that, so much time has passed. Like, hey, we talked about this. Sometimes we feel uncomfortable if so much time has passed. But 5 years had gone by and he's like, so much time has passed, but I just wanted to tell you I was rifling through my things and I came across the note that you sent me. And I just wanted to say that really meant a lot. I was going through a hard time. Um, and so I'm just really thankful that you wrote me that note. So we texted back and forth a little bit. Unfortunately, being in Milwaukee was not like, come over for dinner from
Right.
Chicago. But I think goes to the point of you also really never know how your actions of kindness are going to affect someone. Um, the timing of those actions. There's so many things about neighboring that are out of our control, which I find rather infuriating at times, but also but also such a good reminder, right? That again, I guess I'll just keep coming back to this, like what is the type of neighbor I want to be? And it's not a stalker. We don't need to be stalkers. We don't need to keep bugging people. But maybe just working as we feel led and or convicted to be reaching out, small acts of kindness here and there, just reminding people that we're thinking about them, even if they're not in a season where they have much to give back or are able to connect much back with us too. That's the other thing, like some if people are going through a tough season, they might not have a lot of margin at that time to really reciprocate. I know that I've had that where like we've been going through something tough and it's like, man, I just have no margin right now and have needed people feeding into me. And kind of recognizing that at other times our neighbors will kind of be in that spot too.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. That actually ties back to one of the quotes from your book that I had highlighted here to be sure to mention. You wrote, "What if instead of waiting for people to knock on our door, I intentionally looked for ways to show love and kindness?" And that's it doesn't have to be over the top types of things, right? That's
Hmm.
you're just talking about a consistency and being intentional and making some effort.
Hmm.
That's a
Yeah,
pretty easy formula.
it is. And it can be so individualized too. I think it's really important to think about what season are you in? I mean, I'm in a season where I have 4 kids ages 10 and under at home. That really impacts the things that I'm able to do,
Yes.
the ways I'm able to connect, the ways I want to connect. Actually, I would say I spend a lot more time with neighbor kids than with neighbor adults in this season. Again, just with some of the unique aspects of the neighborhood that we live in. And also because my kids like having friends over to play. So I spend a lot more time with neighbor kids outside, connecting with them, trying to make the block a safe place for them to be, versus necessarily connecting with a lot of adults right now. So it's good to think, those are the basic principles. What does it look like to be consistent? What does it look like to reach out? But then you can take that and you can apply it to your own neighborhood, your own season of life that you're in, and really make it your own.
Yeah. Well, your kids are a great neighbor connector. They're
Oh,
connecting you with other kids, right? And
it's
family.
true. They make me way more social than I ever want to be. Which I appreciate. I do love that. But there's times where it's like, I just want to sit at the playground and read my book while you play. But again, but yes, kids are a natural connector because they like being with the other
Yes.
kids in our neighborhood.
I have jokingly said that, quasi-jokingly said that for years. You want to build neighbor connections, have a kid and get a dog.
Yeah.
Those two, you're going to meet your neighbors with both of
Yes.
those.
So
So
true. It's so
you,
true. I
you
feel like
mentioned, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Bikes too.
And bikes, yeah, biking, strong biking community and biking connections as well.
that is so true. We keep so many extra bikes in our garage that get played with all summer long by the neighbor kids.
You mentioned in your book one of the other quotes I'd highlight, I won't read, but just about being motivated by avoiding guilt trips or the I can't live it down train, that you felt guilt and that was part of what motivated you, but we wanted to avoid that at the same time. We're not trying to guilt anyone into this, but can that also kind of be an indicator that a change is needed?
I would say at times, yes. Like and I would say too, I think it's maybe important to clarify definitions. I think there's a difference between guilt and shame. I will say that.
Oh.
So I see guilt as like, it can be an indicator that something is off, that maybe my actions I need to reflect, or maybe I'm yeah, not being the person I want to be, not living up to the values that I hope to live out in my life. And whereas shame, I see more as like unnecessary guilt, where
Mm.
I'm just always feeling bad about myself, always having a low view of self, carrying a lot unnecessary weight for things that I'm not responsible for. So I think it's important that we distinguish
Mm.
between those two. Like I don't advocate for living in a place of shame. But it is really good to think about what motivates us to be neighbors. Like what motivates us to connect with other people. And I think that at times guilt can uh nudge us. It can nudge us in the right direction if it's something that again we feel like is an important value in our lives that we want to live out, that it can remind us like, hey, if we're saying that this is something that's important to us, let us at least nudge us in the right direction. I do think overall, I've found that there are other things too that have been really big motivators for me, um, such as like gratitude. I do feel like gratitude and just a joy have really motivated me on a deeper level as well. I think there are times where I just reflect on my life and I've had a lot of privileges growing up, a lot of safety, a lot of security, a lot of safety nets that have just helped me have a stable life that I don't know. I just think from my gratitude for those things is a huge motivator for me as a neighbor, because I think a lot of times like, wow, look at what I've been given. Look at this life. Look at these kids. Look at this basic but safe home that I
Yeah.
really love. And those things too can be good motivators for, not always we're not always giving from a place of abundance, but just recognizing the good things in our lives can make us want to share that joy with others too.
Well said. Well, shout out to gratitude.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Well, I'll ask one others, but I know we have class members that have read the book, and you may have a question that you'd like to ask Kendra as the guru of all things introvert, we'll say today. And just type that in chat, and we'll be sure and ask her the question on your behalf. Want to do that? A little off the subject. You have another new book coming out in March.
Mhm.
You want to tell us a little about that new book?
Yes, and so that has been such a switch over the past couple of years. I was writing nonfiction for about a decade, and now I have a publishing contract for 2 novels, which is so
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah.
So this first novel, yes, as you said, is called Between You and Us. It's about a woman who uh it actually has some magical realism in there, so hang on. But she gets to visit a different outcome of her life where her daughter is alive, but then her marriage is in shambles. And so she finds herself in this other outcome of her life trying to navigate it while there's flashbacks to her actual life, um, and her having to choose between those two.
Sounds like
So
your premise.
yes, it is definitely related to grief and exploring grief at the loss of a child. That was a big inspiration for it. But I know that all sounds really heavy. There are some great fun characters in there. There's some great banter in there. So
Well,
some other stuff too to kind of lighten the heaviness of that content.
are there some great and engaged neighbors in there? That's the question.
Well, this is where I was not planning on even going there in this book. So I was like, I need a break. But then it happened. It happened. So I would say it's not necessarily on a neighbor. How would I describe it? I'd almost say that it does dig into social classes.
Okay.
The woman grew up in a neighborhood like the one I live in, actually, and her husband grew up on the much wealthier side of town. So talking about how if there's no like social connection between classes, how that leads to a lot of aloofness or harmful assumptions about the other, and they explore that a lot through their relationship.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't sure what the focus of the book was going to be, so that's great to know
Mhm.
that. And you opened the door to this a little bit. It's been on my mind a lot recently because we had a tragedy in our neighborhood. We had a
Mm.
13-year-old boy die from cardiac arrest,
Oh my goodness.
and the family just a few houses down the street from us. And so, but I've just been reminded time and time again um, of those opportunities of tragedy, how neighbors can become so important, and a safety network and rallying and support of a family and
Mhm.
things. I don't know if you had that type of experience um, during the death of your child, or if were thinking about that some in the writing of your book, the role of neighbors during tragedy.
Mhm.
Any thoughts on that?
Yes, oh, I thought about that so much when I was writing Here Goes Nothing, because yeah, my hope was how can I reach out? How can I be the neighbor that I want to be? And then at the end of writing that book is when we lost our second baby, and I was just we were devastated, and we were, knocked off our feet. We were deeply grieving, and then it was these neighbors who we'd spent time connecting with over the course of a couple of years who really took care of us, who brought us meals, who um checked in on us, who, sent cards, all these things that again remind you that this is why we need to be connected to other people. Like we can't go through these things alone, and it didn't fix our circumstances, that's
Yeah.
didn't change anything. It didn't bring our baby back, but it made grieving just a little more tolerable, just a little more survivable each day, knowing that we were not alone going through it.
Yeah.
And so I just, you want to think about like being a neighbor, not just when there's tragedy. Like when you are slowly feeding into those relationships, it's then during the tragedy that you see some of the fruit, hopefully. And so and the connection with your neighbors. So
Yeah. Yeah. I was reminded here in our neighborhood of this particular family. They had one of their older children passed away about 2 years ago too. So it's actually their second child to die. And within the few days after that, another neighbor in the neighborhood who's had two children die, visited them for a long period of time. And then a neighbor who had a spouse die within the last year visited with them for a long period of time. And I was talking with the dad, and he just said that he had told his wife, "What kind of neighborhood have we moved into? All these people that can relate to our story and checking in on us and showing care," because they've lived here about 2 years.
Mhm.
And when he said that, I just thought, wow, what a moving thing to say, and what a moving thing to see happen for neighbors to show compassion and check in. And I hope that continues.
Yeah.
You don't want it to be one and done. But
Mhm.
when you have proximity and you see people on a regular basis, it's more likely to continue.
Mhm. Yeah.
And what a time to build those connections and relationships.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
Kendra, you've been such a good sport for someone who admits to being an introvert. We know making you talk for a whole hour is um, you know made on your favorite list of favorite things to do, but you've been a great sport. Is there anything that maybe we've not covered or touched upon with that book? Because again, several on the call have read it. Some others I think will soon. Uh, Anything else that maybe we didn't cover from that book, or a highlight you'd like us to leave with?
I see Lydia's comment, she may need a nap now. That might be true. No, but I really appreciate you brought up some great quotes. And I just really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you for asking such thoughtful questions. That as an introvert just makes me feel so loved that you were asking such meaningful questions. So
Oh.
way to go, you.
Well, let me just leave out with my favorite quote from your book then. And I didn't note the page here that's on, but in the book, Here Goes Nothing, Kendra writes, but the fact that I allow my introverted personality to keep me from lending a helping hand because it requires human interaction is flawed. That's the thing about the commandment, love your neighbor. Those situations aren't about me and my fears. They're about my neighbor and his or her needs.
Mhm.
Well, I think you hit it out of the park.
Yeah.
And thank you for the time you've invested with us today to talk about neighboring and neighboring as an introvert. And
Yes.
I've sure enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Thank you. Thank you for what you're doing with this class. It's just really meaningful and just amazing. So I appreciate your work.
Well, I'm sure we'll be in contact again as we're growing out a national Good Neighbor Day effort. I think there's opportunities to continue promoting your book and having connections over the topic of being a good neighbor. So
Fantastic.
it's not the last contact we'll have, I'm sure.
All right. That's good to hear.